Hi everybody, welcome to CryptoBeast episode 10, a very special episode, number 1 and 0 together. And what's 1 and 0 together? Well, that's the entire world of computers. The gate is either open or closed and nothing in between. That thinking has enabled the whole world of electronics that's around us. So in honor of that and the technocracy that we're all living in, I've titled today this episode, Burning Man Acid Tests 2.0 and the Technocracy. And I'm probably the most qualified person in the world to talk about Burning Man. There's certainly people who've been there more times than me and have been there longer than me, but I don't believe there's anybody else who's studied the topic in depth as much as me. And I began a blog in 2012, burners.me, because I was a big fan of Burning Man. I was very enthusiastic about it, completely drinking the Kool-Aid, part of a cult, without even realizing that I was inside a cult. And as I started writing about it and researching it more and more, and following the trivium, trying to get back to original source material as much as I can, I realized that one of the huge things about Burning Man was propaganda. That they actually, for most of their life, the organizations employed a minister for propaganda. And that's how they deal with ruling their community. I mean, it's a city now of 80 to 90,000 people, about to grow above 100,000. Temporary city in the desert in Nevada at the end of August and the beginning of September. And it's been a wonderful experience in my life. And I think for many people, they would say it's a great experience in their life to go to Burning Man and be inspired by what sort of things humanity can come up with when it's, in a spirit of creativity and play. And all those aspects of it are really good, and I support that. But what I kept finding as I dug deeper and deeper and deeper into the story of Burning Man was the deep state and the military-industrial complex and social engineering. And Silicon Valley, it's extremely tied to the military-industrial complex. I recommend you watch a YouTube series, The Secret History of Silicon Valley, by Steve Black. And in terms of the counterculture, a fundamental building block of what I'm going to talk about today is the work of Dave McGowan, who wrote a book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And what he found is that at the birth of the whole hippie movement of that 60s counterculture in Laurel Canyon, all of these musicians just came from nowhere. They just suddenly started showing up from all over the country. And musicians like, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison and The Doors. They all just showed up in Laurel Canyon around about the same time and then started playing in these clubs along the Sunset Strip. And as it turns out, many of them had ties to the military-industrial complex. Either they'd been in the military themselves or they came from military families. Dave's work really exposes that there's so much of this that it surely can't be a coincidence. And it also turns out that in Laurel Canyon, at the top of it, was a facility called Lookout Mountain. And all kinds of movies were made in this Lookout Mountain movie production studio. Marilyn Monroe had classified access to the studio, and it was larger than the commercial Hollywood studios of the day. So, the World War II was an enormous influence in propaganda, and Disney basically became, a front end for the military-industrial complex back then, and I believe it didn't really ever stop. It's promoting both occultism and the goals of the New World Order, and as is all of Hollywood, but Lookout Mountain was specifically doing that. It's operated by an Air Force base, I believe. And now the property is owned by Jared Leto, an actor who happens to be a burner, and he has been sporting that burner look of, pink hair and earrings and that kind of thing. So, there's a distinctive burner look, and that isn't by mistake. That's been quite cleverly socially engineered. I'll also point to other building blocks of this story, which would be my own series, Silicon Valley Secret Weapon, The Shadow History of Burners, and also 50 Years of Flower Power, a show that I did with Joe Atwill, Jan Irvin, and Hans Utter to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love and the Human Being that was held at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. I'm very qualified to talk about Burning Man, having been to it 12 times and having written so much about it on my blog, done all this research into it, but also I've been very much fascinated by the counterculture and lived in Silicon Valley for 20 years, and was lucky enough to have a number of friends who were mad, crazy Deadheads and large participants in the Grateful Dead scene from the very early days of that. And so that sort of has been my crew while I was living in Silicon Valley, and I've met several, members of the Grateful Dead, or family members related to them, and I've got a very good and interesting exposure to that culture. And the '60s counterculture movement, it came out of San Francisco and Silicon Valley. It was socially engineered. It came out of Laurel Canyon and Hollywood as well, definitely. But there was a deliberate act of social engineering, and a lot of the design work for it was done Madison Avenue, Marshall McLuhan, Timothy Leary's famous saying, "Turn on, tune in, drop out." That was developed by Marshall McLuhan and Madison Avenue as a marketing slogan. And before Timothy Leary came to the Human Being to deliver that line, he'd released it in an album and had been circulating the album amongst the cool, hip, underground vinyl scene of the '60s, in preparation for his concert speech. So a lot of this stuff was carefully calculated. And so it is with Burning Man. And, for Silicon Valley, we have the technology, and for Hollywood, we have the movies. And, that's always been the way. Both towns, Los Angeles and San Francisco, have a massive presence from the military-industrial complex, which, if you're just a tourist and you're driving across the Golden Gate Bridge, or even you drive through Silicon Valley, you'll probably go along one of the freeways, like the 101. You see bits of these buildings and you think, oh, that's good, Silicon Valley, I saw it. But it's you really didn't, because you don't know that if this building is like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing. These are like some of the Northrop Grumman, the biggest arms manufacturers in the world. They make more instruments of death and destruction than anybody else. Multi-billion-dollar companies, and there they are in Silicon Valley with enormous presences. The space program, what's going on with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and NASA. All this stuff being run out of Silicon Valley. So it's not just internet technology companies, even though that's what we hear of the most when we're on social media. There's all kinds of technology, and the biggest customer for almost all of this technology is the government. That's who's buying it. So my series on Burning Man is 23.5 hours of video content, and not everybody wants to go through all of that. So if you find any of this material interesting, or you think, oh, that can't be true or whatever, please, I encourage you to go look through the details. And I've got slide presentations with references for everything I'm talking about. But in this presentation, I'm just going to try to run through the whole topic matter and to answer the question, what's my take on Burning Man? And you can't look at Burning Man without Silicon Valley. Elon Musk has said Burning Man is Silicon Valley. The Google founders, they went to Burning Man first, and the first ever logo, the first Google Doodle, was the Burning Man logo. They came back from Burning Man and created the company that became Google. So it was more important to them to go to Burning Man than get a check for $13 million. Think about that, right? And, the year that Google was doing that at Burning Man, the whole theme of Burning Man was the nebulous entity. So every year there's a different theme. And this nebulous entity was a giant ghostly tree kind of being contraption, alien contraption that sucked the information and souls out of everyone in humanity through a huge matrix. And some kind of giant search engine is actually one of the descriptions of the nebulous entity. That's exactly what they said it was. And they launched Google. So if you look at the work of Nafees Ahmed for Insurge Intelligence, you'll see that Google was an NSA and CIA project. It came out of long research going on and being conducted at Stanford, by the Google guys who would rollerblade in to have meetings with the CIA while they were students at Stanford. And one of the Google guys was a member of the Center for Talented Youth at Johns Hopkins University. So was Mark Zuckerberg. So was Lady Gaga. And the campus of this is on Goucher College, where Burning Man's CEO, Marion Goodell, went to school. Just coincidentally, all of these people end up in this world of, high-tech Satanism and Illuminati, many years later in their career. So Burning Man is targeted at Silicon Valley and Hollywood, the creative class cultures, and it's a counterculture experience for those who create the culture. So the culture creators by having this like radical transformative experience, they come out of it, different people. That's the ideal of Burning Man. They see what they've created as a machine to transform people and to transform their lives and their personality, and really to mold them into a type of person who is culturally easy to assimilate into Silicon Valley. If you're a burner, you'll be able to get a job in a Silicon Valley company and be surrounded by a lot of like-minded people. Where, if you're a redneck from a town where you think it's something wrong with men holding hands and kissing each other in the street, you won't be very welcome in Silicon Valley. They will be horrified that somebody like you even exists on the planet, and that tells you a lot about their culture. But, what sort of person would engineer a counterculture, and are the people who create countercultures or these cultural creators, are they really rebels and misfits and visionaries operating outside of the system and making something that's purely for the good of humanity because that's what they say they are? Or in fact, can we look throughout history and see so many times where the powers that shouldn't be are playing both sides of the puzzle, the Hegelian dialectic, where you have the thesis, you have the antithesis, and then you bring the two together and you have the synthesis. So let's say that your predominant culture is going to be drafting for the Vietnam War. Well, then you create a counterculture that's called hippies, where the values of that are about protesting against the Vietnam War, and so by controlling both of those groups, you have both sides of the discussion. And what you might end up with in society is what we did end up with, the Vietnam War and hippies. There were people making money out of both of those groups, same people, many fractured lives and shell-shocked minds and personalities. It's war is horrific. I hope none of us ever has to experience the horrors of war. But in my parents' generation and their parents' generation, that was a thing. Many of them were. One in four adult males in the US was drafted and sent to the Vietnam War, and there were more than 30 million people in the US military over the time that all the various different conflicts in Vietnam took place. This is a huge impact on people's lives, and no wonder people are suffering from post-traumatic stress from being exposed to a war. And then we go a generation later, we have this Iraq Gulf War, which again is been a horrific thing for the people that had to go there, and not just dealing with mental anguish, but in many cases, physical and chemical poisoning to the body. We had the Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, that many soldiers were successful in getting the military to acknowledge that, we sprayed that, we got our own guys with it, they got really sick, we covered it up, we said it wasn't us, and it was us the whole time. Busted, and that's Monsanto, by the way, the company supplying those chemicals. And then in the Iraq War, we have this Gulf War syndrome as well. And so anyway, horrific treatment of our veterans, but I'd be interested to see the numbers of those that went the other way, that amongst the hippie world and the Grateful Dead world and the acid heads and the heroin heads and the coke heads and all of those different people that were exposed to this Crowleyan counterculture, how many lives were destroyed within that? And what was the percentage of, the military social engineering approach versus this, think tank, Macy conferences, cybernetic, drug-fueled, Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, Brave New World cybernetic approach. So, to understand my take on Burning Man, you have to see that 1984 and Brave New World were not just these dystopian works of fiction that through some miraculous gift of prescience exactly came true 80 years after they were written. I don't see that at all. I see that as this is a deliberate plan. And in fact, you can even pin it directly to the Fabian Society by George Orwell. He set the book in the year 2000, but it was moved to be 1984 instead. Because that was the 100-year anniversary of the Fabian Society. And, their strategy is just slow and gradual and subtle changes. Piece by piece, they move the Overton window of what will be acceptable to the people. and the tolerance changes and moves over time. So how can you move the cultural tolerances of an entire generation? Well, it's through electronic means of broadcasting, propaganda, messaging, repetition. And who are the people building those electronic means? They are the people that go to Burning Man. And so here you have this thing, the largest event on government land, on federal land. You know, they pay about $4 million a year to the federal government. They also pay another $3 or $4 million a year to the state of Nevada, just in taxes for having the event. So there's a big money spinner for the government. You've got all kinds of different agencies there. You've got the FBI, CEA, Joint Terrorism Task Force. We've got the documents. We can prove that all of those ones are there. I mean, the DIA is operating there undercover. We've got eyewitness testimony of a DEA informant called Gordon Todd Skinner, who was at Burning Man with 360 grams of MDMA powder, commonly known as ecstasy, and he was handing that out for free. That was his Burning Man gift. This is a DEA informant, agent, operative, someone that is like growing up in a FBI, DEA, IRS family. His mother is a well-connected socialite, and he's operating with the DEA in multiple different cases, like 6 or 7 different cases that this guy's been heavily involved in. Here he is at Burning Man, stealing a stereo to go there, handing out free MDMA to people, with the full knowledge and even protection of the DEA and the FBI as well, having the ability to give immunity to these people. So this guy is currently doing 2 consecutive life sentences in a prison where he's known as Hannibal Lecter, because he took a guy and brutally tortured him with his girlfriend, who was wearing a satanic robe and doing like witchcraft voodoo rituals over the torture victim. This is the type of people who are going to Burning Man. So when you first go and you see it and you meet all these amazing, like, oh, wow, this one's a Hollywood actor, this one's a CEO of a big company, like, oh, that's amazing. You don't really think about everybody else that's at Burning Man and what's truly going on there and why are they there and what do they want out of you. And at first you think, well, they just want me to have a good time, to be free, be myself, party up with my mates. And, back in 1998, Burning Man, when I first went, Burning Man was more about that type of thing. And in 2004, they introduced these principles that Larry Harvey supposedly came up with in Mexico. And he came up with 9 principles, which is a very Luciferian kind of reference right there. There's a thing called the Council of Nine, the ruling body of the Esalen Institute for a time being, which turned out to be Andrea Puharich at Stanford Research Institute, intelligence community, CIA MK Ultra researcher, who had voice-to-skull technology where he could, broadcast words and they would, come in someone's skull. And they used that to entrap some of the wealthiest families in the United States into funding their research and believing they were communicating with this Council of Nine, which was actually an artificial intelligence supercomputer out in space orbiting the Earth and giving them orders telepathically or whatever. The point is that the CIA was coming up with plans like that billionaires would get sucked into back in the 60s, and that's all been exposed and proven now. So Burning Man is the same thing, just an extension of what began with the acid tests, and Stewart Brand was there in the acid tests. Here's what he says about Burning Man.
One more thing about the Trips Festival.
Sure.
I think you're right that we've done some network entrepreneuring and network forums. The Trips Festival was, in a sense, the only successful acid test, in the sense that it was actually quite huge. We had 3 successive nights at Longshoremen's Hall in San Francisco, and 10,000 people showed up, most of them hippies. The thing was, nobody knew that there were 10,000 hippies in San Francisco at that time. So that was a moment of realization for a community isn't the right word, but a regional generation realized how big it was and how rich it was and how much fun it was. And basically the Haight-Ashbury took off as then a community and a domain the day after the Trips Festival.
Huh.
So these kind of events, and the same thing happens with Burning Man a lot now, these kind of events are these coalescing things where you get to find out how many birds of your feather there are.
So I want to read you a few quotes from Stewart Brand. First one, probably the most visible and influential continuation of counterculture is Burning Man. It has all sorts of remarkable qualities, one of which continues the premise of Ken Kesey's acid tests. Put together a bunch of creative people and a minimum of rules, and everybody generates as nifty a party as they possibly can. So Stewart Brand, he was one of the ex-military people involved in the acid tests, the Merry Pranksters, and the Grateful Dead scene as well. He was the Pentagon's most senior photographer, a former paratrooper. He'd been a military instructor and trainer. And then he appears in the Stanford scene just in time for the birth of Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which he's immediately given a tour of. And even today, that's probably one of the most secure computing facilities in the world. But can you just imagine in 1962, the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at Stanford, how advanced and cutting edge that was of the breakaway civilization, secret space program, military industrial complex, research and development, whatever you want to call it. This guy was all over it, and he was also all over the Merry Pranksters. About the Grateful Dead, he says, "Our band was a group called the Warlocks, which later became the Grateful Dead. A number of people around the group were ex-army like I was. A number were artists. It was very improvisational." And, without wanting to get too bogged down into this angle of the story, I mean, it's probably news to people who haven't really studied the counterculture, but, building on Dave McGowan's work, looking at Laurel Canyon and all the military links to the musicians there, you should also take a look at Jan Irvin and Joe Atwell's work on manufacturing the Deadhead, a product of social engineering. But I'll just run through some names very quickly. So we've got Stewart Brand, Pentagon, Ken Kesey. He was part of the CIA's MK Ultra project. He wrote the novel One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, movie with Jack Nicholson, Oscar winning, lots of awards. And he was out of Stanford. Ken Babs, he's a decorated military chopper pilot, not one medal, multiple medals and commendations. Jerry Garcia, I've, through a FOIA request, found out that he had a secret security clearance. There's no indication that was revoked when he left the military, because he'd been assigned to the Nike missile program in the brief time he was in the army. You've got Robert Hunter from the Grateful Dead. He's also part of the CIA's MK Ultra program, big time Scientologist. Hank Harrison, Courtney Love's father. She's actually in one of the Grateful Dead albums. She grew up amongst this whole scene. He's a Bohemian Grove guy. One of his books about the Dead is dedicated to the boys at the Bohemian Club. And he said that the thing about the Grateful Dead is they all came from Masonic families. You got Bob Weir and Mickey Hart of the Dead are both Bohemian Grove guys. John Perry Barlow recently passed away, bless his soul. He's CIA, NSA consultant to the intelligence community, from a Masonic family. Tom Constantine and Bear Owsley, the Grateful Dead, they've come out of the Air Force. Alan Trist, who was a friend of Jerry's and basically their first manager. His father, Eric Trist, was one of the founders of the Tavistock Institute, and he was visiting Stanford for a year doing a project there. Well, this project just happened to be when guys like Allen Ginsberg and Neil Cassidy just show up in Perry Lane on the campus of Stanford, which is actually Camp Fremont. There's a section of Stanford that was seized by the military in around the 1920s, and that military section of Stanford, as best as I can tell, has remained operating as part of the Stanford campus. And that's where Sandhill Road is, where all the venture capital companies are located. Some of the most advanced facilities are in this Camp Fremont military area, and also Perry Lane, where this was the foundational point of the Beats generation merging with the Merry Pranksters, Warlocks, Grateful Dead, when this operation was launched with all the LSD as part of the CIA's MK Ultra program being supplied by Captain Trips Al Hubbard, who himself had been an agent of the OSS. He was a special investigative agent for Stanford Research Institute, working directly for Willis Harman, who's also the founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. They're doing experiments at Burning Man. Timothy Leary from the scene, he said the CIA, he gives him full credit for creating the entire counterculture movement of the 60s. Also emerged after his death that he had been an FBI informant, heavily cooperating for many months on multiple cases with the FBI. You've got Gordon Wasson, the vice president of propaganda for JP Morgan, personal friend and student of Edward Bernays, who just happens to come up with magic mushrooms and launch it on the cover of Life magazine. He's a member of Century Club, which is kind of the East Coast New York version of Bohemian Club, and also so is Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine and the Time Empire, who's a Skull and Bones guy out of Yale. And so these Skull and Bones, which is funded by the Russell Trust, built up by massive opium trade fortune with the British East India Company. These opium traders, secret societies, here we find them again trying to launch the 60s counterculture around the supply of drugs to the mass market. You've got Billy Mellon Hitchcock, where Timothy Leary was at the Millbrook estate of the Mellon family. You've got Richard Helms, the CIA director, meeting frequently with the Mellons during this whole period. And then Billy Mellon Hitchcock's working with Johann Paravicini, which is an ancient Venetian banking family, probably Knights Templars, and Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead married to him, coming out of the Macy conferences, where they are trying to design after World War II the cybernetic method for controlling all of humanity. So this whole little group is there clustered around Stanford and the CIA's MK Ultra project at the time of the Grateful Dead being launched as the Warlocks. You got Allen Ginsberg, he's a member of NAMBLA. We've got video of him delivering a speech or a poem about his love for a little boy at a NAMBLA conference. He's also got video of him singing songs about the CIA and their opium trafficking. So that's the Stewart Brand group at Stanford. The counterculture has basically come out of that group. I'm not for 100% convinced he was in charge of it. I couldn't tell you who he would have reported to, but there's no other candidate I can see in this project who would have been in charge of it. I mean, Stewart Brand is in a way like the Forrest Gump of Silicon Valley, that every single major development, he was somehow there, from the birth of the Grateful Dead to the birth of desktop publishing and the mouse to the first live streaming broadcast over what really was the internet back when he did that. That's what we had of electronic communications networks, and was an amazing feat of engineering, and that guy's been at the front of everything ever since. So I have mad respect for Stewart Brand, and he has mad respect for Burning Man. And let me give you the final quote from him on it. Burning Man, they've surpassed in every way the various things we were attempting with the acid tests and the Trips Festival. Burning Man has realised with such depth and thoroughness and ongoing originality and ability to scale and minimalist rules, but enough rules that you can function, and all the things we were farting around with Larry Harvey has really pulled off. I don't think that would have come to pass without going through whatever that spectrum of the 60s was. The prism of the 60s, the spectrum of bright light colours that we espoused for a while. It all got exacerbated by the internet and sequence of computer-related booms, but I think it flavoured a whole lot of the basic nature of Burning Man. So there's no bigger authority on the acid tests and their connection to the technocracy than Stewart Brand. He was not just at them, he was organising them. He was putting these things on, and he's saying Burning Man is surpassed. It's the greatest realisation of their vision of the acid test. So who was doing the testing on whom in the acid tests? Well, the patients, or the victims, the experiment victims, they were the people that went to the acid tests, took the acid, danced to the Grateful Dead, and had a great time, all the while being observed by intelligence agencies and academic think tanks, human behaviour specialists and anthropologists, psychiatrists, things like that. And who was it then doing the experimenting? I mean, you could just call it the man, whether you call it the deep state or the New World Order or the secret society. It doesn't really matter who that is, and that's perhaps discussion for another day anyway. But in the whole case of Burning Man, we have this symbol of the man that's being burned at the end of it, this giant effigy, and it's going back to the days of the Wicker Man and the Druids and the secret societies, the Bohemian Grove, the Skull and Bones. This is Druids. This is the same type of thing. Occult magic, practice in secret, usually at night, either outdoors in the woods or in a cave or a dungeon somewhere. Fire magic. And you can see the movie The Wicker Man. Clearly Burning Man is based on this, very well-known Celtic ritual. And the Druids, this is around the time of Julius Caesar when he went to invade Great Britain, and he travelled through Gaul, which was France. He came across these Druids and he wrote about them. He wrote about them burning humans inside this giant wicker man. So this is something that's thousands of years old. In New Mexico, Zozobra, they've been doing that for, I think, about 100 years. There's a festival in Spain, which is going on right now, based on very similar ideas. Part of what I've shown in my research is that the earliest I could trace these things going on in the Bay Area is back to 1979, with a ritual effigy burn of Beelzebub down in Sausalito. I believe it was in Dunphy Park. And this was a Snake River Theatre group was involved with that. It evolved on to Wicker Man burns that were going on Ocean Beach, being conducted by Timothy O'Neill in 1984 and 1985, I believe. And then Larry Harvey doing his first one in 1986. And there's all these different creation myth stories around the foundation of Burning Man that come from the founders themselves. And they'll even say, like Larry says, I've got all these stories I tell and some of them are true. This is the sort of people that are involved in this thing. But I don't believe that the management team and the founders of Burning Man are these amazing social engineering masterminds. They're part of a social engineering project, and Larry Harvey is quite open about saying that they're social engineers and that's what they do. He's, I think, rather proud of it. And this guy's been brought in to brief the chief of naval operations and the top commanders of the Navy in what he's learned strategically from Burning Man. I mean, does that go on for a rave, or does that go on for a military project that's been going on for decades now and has been very successful in terms of a psychological operation to recruit people for the Silicon Valley of the desired culture and to mold and to shape and to engineer the cultures and values that then get imprinted into Silicon Valley and Hollywood, which go into all the products that are shared out with the world. And ultimately this is the machine of the man, the electronic information spewing propaganda machine. And many of the people that build that machine and feed it with content go to Burning Man. This is an occult festival that's grown out of small groups of people very much connected to secret societies, the occult and magic. The earliest themes of Burning Man, they didn't always have themes, but after about 10 years they introduced themes, and the first themes that they brought in were all to do with Satanism, and they had a complete massive thing called Hellco with events at art galleries in San Francisco in 1996 that were astonishingly well funded when you look at the amount of choreography, costumes, makeup that these people have that they're performing with. This is a grand scale art spectacle and raises the question of who was funding this thing back when only 1,000 people went to it and paid $30 a ticket or whatever. That's for the event itself. Well, who was funding all of this Satan stuff? And anyway, you could delve into that more in my series, but who are the social engineers? Well, some of the social engineers that we know of through history are the British East India Company, the Tavistock Institute, the Frankfurt School that became the New School for Social Research, branched out into the Institutes for Advanced Study, which includes the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, the Esalen Institute, basically a Stanford spin-off by two military guys, California Institute for Integral Studies, quite influential on Larry Harvey. The Rand Corporation, that's sort of more the Hollywood side of things, and then the Stanford Research Institute, that became SRI International when too many students were protesting against all of the massive amount of military and defense department contracting that Stanford Research Institute was doing, and they still do that today. They just moved it down the road and gave it a more corporate name. The military-industrial complex is all over Silicon Valley. They were all over the Presidio, which is the major military base at the edge of the Golden Gate Bridge. This was the first part of San Francisco that was settled. So San Francisco was a military base before it was anything else. In 1776, the Presidio base opened, and the state of California wasn't incorporated until 1850. So the Presidio was hugely influential in the history of San Francisco. And the internet was birthed and launched at basically the same time as Burning Man. So they disconnected ARPANET, which was originally developed, was called ARPA then, is called DARPA now. They connected the military part of that and made that MILNET, and then they broke free ARPANET to become the modern internet. And all the decisions and big moves to make this happen occurred around the time of the birth of Burning Man, particularly in 1986. But we've also tracked some of the things leading up to that. But 1986, as well as the internet and Burning Man being launched, and the online community, you had MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and these are people that had previously been involved in the research of things like MDMA, psilocybin. In 1986, you had the birth of Burning Man, the Cacophony Society, the internet, the Well Electronic Network, the hacker conferences. Some of this was 85, but this period leading up to the birth of Burning Man was enormously important time in the life of the internet. And it really appears to me that Burning Man and the internet were launched at the same time, at the same place, by the same people, and that there was a vision all along that there would be sort of acid tests too, as this cultural epicenter of the internet, in the way that the Grateful Dead scene had emerged to be the unifying cultural force amongst all the various tech and military companies within the Bay Area. A lot of these engineers were deadheads, and that was they'd get together around the Grateful Dead and around LSD and other forms of hallucinogenic drugs. So, fast forward to today, and we have Burning Man's been going for 30 years. And most of the people involved in it, and particularly involved in its founding, are connected to the military-industrial complex, intelligence agencies, New World Order. In fact, Larry Harvey, the founder, he said that he believes the principles and ethos of Burning Man will one day become the governing principles of a new world order. So, he's quite open about saying this, and this is the main guy that invented it and is in charge of it. So if I say that he says that, people think that I'm some crazy conspiracy theorist, but, I'm someone who loved Burning Man, who did the research and found all this stuff that's basically, hidden in plain sight if you can be bothered to look for it. And in order to even look for this information about Burning Man, I had to break through the spell and the trance that's part of the cult. And you're convinced that all the people involved are good people doing good, and all the people who go the burners are good people, and you're part of this good thing doing good. And as long as you all stay together and don't rock the boat and don't cause conflict, you'll all be good together. And then you start to get into some of the other cult-like behaviours, like, don't question the leader, and, there's not enough money, we need everyone to give more money, even as the ticket prices are going up and the audience sizes are skyrocketing. And the thing about Burning Man is that they don't put on any entertainment. They try to use this argument to get out of paying the live entertainment tax in Nevada, but, so far it didn't fly. But, you know, all of the entertainment at Burning Man is provided by the burners themselves. All of the alcohol, all of the food, all of the world-class DJs and musicians, the massive sound stages, the massive art sculptures, it's funded by the burners themselves. And you might think, well, yeah, from their ticket money. But no, you know, about 1% of the ticket money, if we're lucky, actually goes to the art at Burning Man. And the rest of it is the infrastructure of this Burning Man organisation, who, in my opinion, are not at all the masterminds of this project. Their job is to just keep the thing running so that DARPA can, you know, do whatever test projects it wants to do there. So, you know, the Burning Man takes place on military land or former military land. It was the Lovelock Aerial Gunning Range. It's very close to Naval Air Station Fallon, where they have the Top Gun and the Carrier Pilot Training School. They have the Navy's first electronic warfare range there, and it was a trial site for the SAGE system, which was a key computer system in our national air defence in the original development of computers. So this area has been, you know, important to computing and used for high-tech military experiments, you know, since World War II. And it's harsh conditions, you know, if you look at what was learned in the MK Ultra and even the British East India Company, some of these torture techniques that are in the CIA manual and get used in Guantanamo today, like, you know, exposure to harsh elements, not enough water, sleep deprivation, you know, wind and dust. The playa surface is very alkaline, and if you walk on it in bare feet, it cracks your skin. It's very hard on electrical and electronic components. So it's actually, you know, quite a good testing ground for the military. If their equipment can survive out there and work fine, it'll probably work fine anywhere in the world. You've got extremes of hot and cold being in the desert at night as well. And it's actually one of the best places on the planet for amateur rocketry launches. So there's a history of people going out to Burning Man to do rocketry launches. The two people that came up with the idea of moving it to the desert, Carrie Galbraith and Kevin Evans, she's recently passed away, but they were both involved in the video games and computer animation space. She was a Fulbright scholar, which the Fulbright scholarship has been quite heavily linked to the CIA and also the Rockefeller Foundation. Worked for a company called Spectrum Holobyte, founded by a guy called Gilman Louis. He was the chairman of it, and he went on to head up In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital company. So that's just some of the Burning Man connections. The founder, Larry Harvey, his dad was a Mason. His brother went to D. Malay, the elite school of the Freemasons. I guess he was driven to create his own secret society that's a bit like the Masons and full of Masons, but not really them. You know, these different lodges keep branching off into different forms of the same secret society, secret handshake, cult-like, you know, druidic, occult interpretation. And Marion Gildell, CEO, co-founder of Burning Man, you know, she came from an elite family. Her dad's company, American Brass Company, was involved in the Manhattan Project, and I found one instance of them making shell casings for a military in Israel, but I'm sure they did the same for domestic military as well. She grew up riding around in America in a private rail car called the Dagny Taggart after Ayn Rand, and Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, which started next to the Presidio military base, just like Burning Man started next to the Presidio military base, he said that Satanism is Ayn Rand with trappings. So her values of objectivism were basically built into a theatrical kind of production by Anton LaVey with, you know, an occult element to it, and that was the Church of Satan. And then coming out of the Presidio military base, you also have Michael Aquino's Temple of Set, you know, the satanic priest that was serving in the military and in the PSYOPs team at the Presidio. The Presidio PSYOPs team, you know, the headquarters of the military or the Army PSYOPs unit, that moved about 1992 down to what is the Googleplex today. and basically the entire modern World Wide Web sprung up around that PSYOPs unit when it moved down there. Possibly just a coincidence. Michael Aquino's mother, Betty Aquino, was a founder of the KPFA Berkeley, which was used at the birth of the World Wide Web, known as the WELL, the Whole Earth Electronic Link. A guy called David Gans had a Grateful Dead show that he would use to promote the WELL and use the WELL to promote his show, vice versa, uniting all of the deadheads together on this new web technology that was emerging, which was actually introduced to the world by Larry Brilliant, the Grateful Dead's doctor, now the head of Google.org, and Stewart Brand, of course. And from a behavioural sciences conference, they decided that this technology Larry had called PicoSpan, they could build discussion forums and boards and get it chatting, and then very soon they had John Perry Barlow involved, a very talented man with words and, songwriter for the Grateful Dead, commenting and getting into these forum discussions with everyone. So this became the birth of the World Wide Web. It went on to Mondo 2000 magazine and Wired magazine, with tools being used to set the culture of the web and of the internet at the time. And this is around the time that TV shows are coming out saying that Burning Man is the physical manifestation of cyberspace. Wired magazine puts Burning Man on its cover, a story by Bruce Sterling, who writes about many deep state connected topics, saying Burning Man, the new American holiday, in which his daughter says it was a living nightmare. But that's what they want, the people that are drawn to the nightmare, because these people are Satanists and Luciferians. This is an occult ritual that takes place inside a pentagon. And if you connect the inner vertices of the pentagon to each other, it makes a pentagram inside the pentagon, and the borders of that pentagram perfectly describe the circle shape of Burning Man City, Black Rock City, which is 0.666666% of a circle. It's 2/3 of a circle, the hemicircle space that they have. So who is developing the acid? Well, we know that's the CIA. That's banking families like Warburg and Mellon were involved in the development of that. JP Morgan was involved with the magic mushrooms, at least peripherally, with his agent Wasson being the chosen one. But, there's many letters that we have from Wasson written on JP Morgan letterhead. I think we have to assume that the Morgan family knew exactly what Wasson was up to, and not that any of his antics ever caught them by surprise. I want to go to another quote now about Burning Man, which is from John Perry Barlow. And, this is to answer the question of why would you engineer the hippie culture? And the answer is to control the hippies. How would you control them? Well, it's various forms of mind control. Propaganda is mind control. Fake news is a form of mind control. This is called mind war, and that Michael Aquino has developed this concept which described Fox News and CNN before they existed, described embedding journalists in with the military so that the military could spin the propaganda in any way that they wanted. He's admitted that he got most of his theories about mind war from the Esalen Institute, their Human Transformation Project, and they in turn had actually got most of it from the Russians. So there you go, perhaps there's some Russian collusion at the core of all of this propaganda and mind war after all. But here's John Perry Barlow, and he's talking about Karl Rove, who was an advisor to President Bush at the time. If someone like Karl Rove had wanted to neutralise the most creative, intelligent and passionate members of his opposition, he'd have a hard time coming up with a better tool than Burning Man. Exile them to the wilderness, give them a culture in which alpha status requires months of focus and resource-consumptive preparation, provide them with metric tons of psychotropic confusicants, and then ignore them. It's a pretty safe bet that they won't be out registering voters or doing anything that might actually threaten electoral change when they have an art car to build. Now, I just want to pause it there and point out that for a lot of Burning Man's life, it was on at the same time as the Republican and Democratic conventions. So a lot of the politicians' staffers would go to Burning Man. That let the politicians more free to do their type of partying at the convention without the staffers, reporting back to base about everything they got up to. Just my theory on it. Anyway, back to Barlow's quote, and this bit of it is not so well known. He says, indeed, Burning Man strikes me as only one of many reality distortion fields within which the counterculture, myself totally included, has sought self-ghettoizing refuge. On reflection, I realised that I felt much the same about the massive protest marches that failed to impede in any way the administration's unprovoked assault on Iraq. We all had a grand time gathering ourselves by the millions, but we're up against opponents far more practical than Dick Nixon or Spiro Agnew. The current Dick knows that the best way to deal with dissent is to give it a spectacle to exhaust its energies on. He knows that we're suckers for a good show, especially one where we get a starring role, so he gives us unmolested stages upon which to mount our extravaganzas and goes on about his corporate affairs. Now, this is a very telling comment from someone who was, at Millbrook with Leary, and with Billy Mellon Hitchcock, at it, living at it, going to the parties there, bringing the Grateful Dead there for the first time, bringing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band vinyl to Millbrook to play it for Leary for the first time. That's John Perry Barlow, lifelong friends with Bob Weir, breaking into NORAD when he was 16. Connected to the deep state through his Masonic family, governors of Wyoming. And, John Perry Barlow is the guy that got Dick Cheney elected in his first ever run for office. He was his campaign manager. Dick Cheney, who he's talking about here. What does he say? He says the current Dick. Yeah, the current Dick, he means Cheney. A self-ghettoizing reality distortion field is a fantastic way to describe Burning Man, but also to describe why someone would, like the deep state, why would they socially engineer Burning Man? And it's to create these little bubbles and pockets, not just to be able to put you in a trance, hypnotize you, and lead you into these different areas where your social network and scene can be infiltrated by agents very easily. You're very receptive to meeting new people and becoming lifelong friends with them because you've shared this incredibly challenging experience together. Maybe they even, produced something just at the right time that saved the day for you. You've just been talking about an hour before, or, who knows. But it's absolutely without a shadow of a doubt that you're being tracked at Burning Man. You're being recorded on all kinds of high-definition cameras with day and night vision capabilities. You're being recorded by satellites, by drones, by low-orbit satellites, by aeroplanes with hyperspectral imaging capabilities that can detect exact substances. They can say what's marijuana, what's GHB, what's cocaine. Just flying a plane over this thing, they know where all that stuff is. And yet at Burning Man, in a poll we ran on burners.me, anonymous poll, we had 1,300 people responded, and 95% of them said that they had taken illegal drugs at Burning Man before. And, I think that's probably representative of the burners. This is what's going on federal land, crawling with cops, crawling with undercover agents, all kinds of alphabet agencies there, military land, and it's being used as a staging ground for DARPA projects being run by all of these ex-military people. When you go there and you get your ticket, it says that you voluntarily consent to serious injury or even death. So you're entering these acid tests, accepting a contract where you may well die as a result of what goes on inside. And, people do die there, and people die there in occult rituals and in strange fashions. And, the last person who died, he just got up and ran into the fire at Burning Man last year. I gotta say, that dude seems to be showing some signs of someone mind controlled. Why would you just freaking jump in a fire and kill yourself in front of 80,000 people, including little kids? There are little kids at Burning Man. That's something that people can't believe either. There's 4,000 or 5,000 little kids at Burning Man. Kids under 12 get in free. And it's a pedophile's paradise, and there are definitely pedophiles there. There are pedophiles who've been arrested saying that they're planning to go to Burning Man to kidnap some kids. They have Amber Alerts there where they have to shut the whole festival gate down because someone's teenage daughter ran off with their 26-year-old boyfriend, There is stuff going on at Burning Man that children should not be exposed to at all. So why is that allowed to go on? Is freedom of speech really that important in the desert in Nevada that little kids have to be exposed to naked people and rampant drug use? or is this a desire of pedophiles? And you look at Larry Harvey, the Burning Man founder, he was in letter, at least correspondence, if not more, with Peter Lamborn Wilson, also known as Hakeem Bey. And this guy is another NAMBLA guy. This is someone whose Wikipedia page says that he's a pedophile. Anyway, I mean, I could go on about that for quite a while, but there's a lot of the people connected to Burning Man are not just the military connections they have, but it's secret society connections. The Masons, there's many of them that wear fezzes. There's a guy called Danger Ranger who he went and actually hooked up the wiring for Wired magazine's first office, and he was part of the Mondo 2000 party house scene. He said he was the connection between the Stanford chemistry lab and Burning Man. And so there you go. The drugs are coming in from the Stanford chemistry lab, just like they were during the CIA's MK Ultra acid tests. And heavily tied to the tech industry. Well, John Perry Barlow, Timothy Leary, they were also on the mastheads of these magazines, at their founding. So here's this whole crew together, and the counterculture was used to sell computing. And Apple, when they launched the Mac, they had a famous commercial where all these people in suits were working in black and white. It was the IBM world, and it was 1984. The Olympics were on in Los Angeles, and this female hammer thrower was one of America's best medal prospects. So she comes running in, screaming like enough or something, and swings this hammer around and throws it at the screen, and it cracks the screen and everything becomes colour. And the Macintosh was colour. And by introducing colour, referencing back to the hippies who had their further bus and their day glow colours, and they associate these bright primary colours with that time of their lives experience of the 60s and the Grateful Dead era or whatever. This is triggering all of that stuff. Colour, and the Apple Macintosh is the tool of the creative class, and it worked. And they had digital beings that reference the original human being in Golden Gate Park with the same characters involved: Stewart Brand, Timothy Leary, John Perry Barlow, and the professional promoters behind these digital beings, particularly a guy called Michael Gosney. They were also encouraging and promoting Burning Man and camps at Burning Man and events at Burning Man. So Burning Man was tied to Macworld and tied to the use of the counterculture to promote, first of all, personal computing and the Macintosh itself, and then to promote, mobile computing, smartphones, the internet, the World Wide Web, the Tesla Roadster. When Tesla first came out, that was taken to Burning Man for its first debut, parked, in a high traffic area, showroom area there. So they say there's no commerce at Burning Man, but if you're the Google guys or if you're Elon Musk, you can do as much commerce and business there as you want. Like, it's basically there for you to do that. And, back in the 60s, Steve Jobs has talked about taking LSD being one of the 3 most transformative things in his life. And that this was a secret symbol that if there was another CEO and you knew that, they were a deadhead or had been to a Dead concert, then that meant that they'd probably dropped acid, so they were probably cool. So you guys could probably be cool and get on really well. And then, that was the fundamental essence of business, where the counterculture of the 60s basically became the mainstream culture. We have John Kerry, Secretary of State of the US, Skull and Bones guy. He's got a picture of the Grateful Dead behind him on his office desk. Tony Blair, Prime Minister of the UK. He was in a Grateful Dead covers band when he was at Oxford. Alex Allen, who was his head of intelligence for the entire British intelligence service, a world expert on the Grateful Dead. There's so many connections, and not just between the Grateful Dead and the military-industrial complex, but between Burning Man and this group, and between Burning Man and the Grateful Dead. I mean, this is just, in many ways, the same people in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, connected to Bohemian Grove, connected to the Freemasons, connected to the occult, and connected to intelligence agencies and the State Department and DARPA, Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency. They call this the Burning Man Project, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Well, what's it a project of? It's a project of whom to do what? and it's obviously a high budget project because it's about $40 million a year right now on government land. So this government $40 million project, funded mostly by the taxpayers, who's it for? Well, there's one group in the government that does projects, and that's called DARPA. And DARPA does projects at Burning Man. And people from DARPA projects go to Burning Man and do projects at Burning Man. People get equipment from DARPA projects and take it to Burning Man and incorporate in their Burning Man projects. I mean, I have published in my notes a 20-page list of connections between Burning Man and DARPA and different projects that have been done out there, and I've got people that are military insiders in their own words saying we go to Burning Man to do testing. It's an austere testing environment for the military. There's also a lot of connections between Burning Man, the occult, and Satanism. And the values of the Church of Satan and the 10 principles of Burning Man are almost identical. It's very much an attack on God. Monotheism is discouraged. And, they had a whole series of essays a few years ago about Burning Man called The Death of God, Burning Man and the Death of God. And it just happens to coincide with discussion in Silicon Valley that they are building a new God. These artilects, these massive artificial intelligence platforms like Google and Facebook, they're connected to all of our data, and all of us with our cell phones and our other internet connections, we're just like sensor nodes, and we're emitting data constantly, feeding it into these artilects. And the artilect knows everything about us, more than we know about ourselves, but it knows everything about everyone else as well. And so if you're interacting with someone and it's like, let's say that you're a young single guy and you've met a hot girl, you've got her phone number, you call her up, it's like, hey baby, would you like to come out on a date with me? And she's like, oh no, I'm washing my hair. Now, maybe she validly is washing her hair, and therefore that particular night doesn't want to come out with me. But more likely, if I heard that from a young lady, I'd think that that was an excuse and she didn't really want to go out with me, but she was saying something different, right? And so all through society, everybody is kind of making little excuses or little distortions, or reality distortion fields all the way through just to get by. And the Artilect knows all of that. It knows what's true, and it knows what's reality distortion, what's exaggeration, what's a lie, and it can measure things like how many of the things that you say going about your day are actually true statements and how much is bullshit. And then it can have a bullshit quotient on everybody in society. Some people always speak the truth. Some people always speak lies. Most people, I would say, is a spectrum in between where it may not even be constant from 1 week or 1 month to the next. But Siri is always listening. Amazon Echo is always listening. Alexa, Google, OK Google. These things, they're always listening. They're always watching, and they're always refining their models. And there's a system called the Sentient World Simulation where they have all of us modeled in massive computer systems where they can run simulations of events and work out how we'd respond. Not how we, mass groups of people would respond, how each individual one of us would respond, and our family members and our friends, what we'd say to them, whatever. And not only do they run in these simulations, but when things happen, then they can see how much did events play out close to their simulation, and they can fine-tune the simulation. So how do you get humans to build computer systems that are going to be the death of humanity, that are really going to bring about the end of the world? Well, first of all, you've got to give them this ideology, the satanic ideology. The religion for atheists is that we're all going to merge with Google and we'll live forever because we have Google in our brain. We'll be like brains in a jar like the Matrix or whatever, but our personalities are there forever in Facebook. I mean, I don't choose that religion, but a lot of the people pushing it are otherwise rational, sane, intelligent people. And yet they're somehow wedded to this crazy freaking idea. And so this is first of all, they have to create this, in Silicon Valley, we're building a god and that's good. But then they got to sell it to you. And how do they sell it to you? Well, they pound it into you. They pound it into you chemically. Drugs, repetitive beats, hypnosis, messages that you're just hearing again and again and again, pulsing lights, flicker frequencies, inaudible subliminal messages that are just either suggested to you via your ears or beamed directly into your brain. These are all the types of technologies that Silicon Valley has been experimenting with since before Burning Man even came along. And Burning Man is in many ways the perfect, ideal place to conduct such experiments where the people have chosen to opt in and accept the risks of experiments. So if it's not being done there, you tell me where the hell else in the world they are doing this type of experiment on mass population. And, perhaps it is Coachella and places like that. Further future, it's expanded on. But, Burning Man contains all the elements of a cult. The members of it quite happily acknowledge that it's a cult, that then, they prefer to be part of it, which just gets marketed to them as home. When you arrive at Burning Man, you're home. People prefer to be part of their Burning Man family than, their traditional family and their traditional cultural values, because they've left all of that behind to come to Silicon Valley. Now they're in a anything goes place, freewheeling San Francisco, as it's always been since before the gold rush. Burning Man's used for recruitment. They want to draw the people of the right kind to Silicon Valley. And it's no coincidence that the demographics of Burning Man are almost identical to the demographics of Google and Facebook, which is predominantly white, quite a few Asians. Asians are welcome. Very, very few African American and Hispanics. And that's just the demographics of it, That's what Burning Man is. That's what Silicon Valley is. Is that a coincidence? I mean, the founder of Burning Man says black people don't like to go camping. And he seems quite proud of that social engineering aspect of it. Burning Man's used for programming, and the founders of Burning Man have admitted that. They can set cultural values, and that has changed over time at Burning Man, and it's changed over time in Silicon Valley. You can say, well, it's art, one reflects the other, but what we've seen time and time again is the deep state infiltrating the art world to drive the narratives and agendas that they want to push. Burning Man, it's a harsh environment designed to break down your conditioning. There's a lot of potential for subliminal messaging with acoustic, visual, flicker rates, sound frequencies, electronic narco-hypnosis. There's a skills transfer aspect to this where you're transferring maker skills and survival skills. There's also the possibility for entrapment with drugs, honey traps. With an experiment, people are being recorded, filmed, measured, tested, tracked. Their reactions are being tracked. To get tickets to Burning Man, you have to create a burner profile where you have to answer a huge array of questions that no other dance party in the world makes you go through, including, if you want to write a 1,000-word essay about why you want to go to Burning Man. And then they have their annual census, which is like a 70-page document being run by Oxford University and the Templeton Foundation. Sir John Templeton, who set up the Templeton Foundation, proudly writes in his autobiography that he was recruited by the CIA when he was 22. So here we have another intelligence linked think tank connected to Burning Man and doing this massive survey of which of the 71 genders are you, and why do you identify as a queer spirit more than a two spirit, or forgive me if I've got the pronunciation of those genders wrong, but they're unfamiliar genders to me. And so, as well as that tracking part of Burning Man, and some of the military people there have software that they use in Afghanistan, and they take their whole burner team to Afghanistan, where people are tracked from the eye in the sky as if they're like little ants. And it tracks who they meet with and where they go and who's with them at that location when they're there, for mass amounts of population at once. And so these guys are going to Burning Man, where eye in the sky satellite imagery is imaging burners not as if they're ants, but in incredibly clear resolution, so people sitting at home watching the internet feed can clearly identify people at Burning Man who probably think the outside world is a million miles away. They don't realise that they're being live streamed across the planet while they're wearing a G-string and some pasties. And this is an occult ritual. It's on a mass scale. There's a lot of intensity there, particularly due to the breaking down of conditioning from the harsh environment. The effigy burn, the ancient occultic tradition of that taking place inside a pentagram. This is one of the most powerful and public mass occult rituals in the world. And I would definitely say that it is black magic there. I don't see any white magic going on there ever. And, you know, the religion of no religion of Google is basically the same thing as Satanism. And it's distinct from Luciferianism. They're not worshipping this, like, evil Burning Man devil god. They're worshipping nothingness and the void and themselves. You know, self is God is a theme of Burning Man and a theme of the Church of Satan. And so this is the Changing Images of Man project that was run out of the Stanford Research Institute by Will Harmon in the 70s. They were saying we need humanity to transform from, you know, the ruggedy, outdoorsy, pioneer kind of typical American man, the Marlboro man, to a new type of worker. You know, let's call him the new age man. And now the Burning Man, the Burner Man, you know, this is a new type of worker again that they keep using these same techniques of anthropology developed at Stanford, you know, in deep state projects connected to the CIA's MKUltra project. They keep using these same tactics and techniques through Burning Man. And Burning Man's also heavily connected to the Esalen Institute. So who's doing the acid tests? Well, you know, the CIA developed the acid, the CIA... and the banksters funded the development of it through foundations. The CIA's MKUltra project funded 149 different sub-projects experimenting with all different ways that these substances would affect the human population. So we know the CIA was doing the acid test. So who's doing the acid test today? Well, I'd have to say DARPA, and that doesn't mean there's no CIA people there. I know for a fact that there are. But in terms of if Burning Man was an official project of anybody, I would say it's a project of DARPA, and just given the number of DARPA people that are involved in it. So anyway, the burner themselves, just to wrap it up, this type that they've created, it's like this virtue signaling, social justice warrior, millennial leftist. This archetype, if you like, was basically formed from the San Francisco Bay Area, the East Bay or the Left Bay, you know, Oakland and Berkeley. And, you know, this archetype, that originally the burner was more of a Mad Max rogue and anarchist surviving out of the Wild West. But lately, you know, in the burner culture and the social justice warrior culture, they've kind of merged together, and a burner is, you know, a social justice warrior, and that's who they want to be populating their organizations, not radical entrepreneurs, not deep thinkers against the man, not crypto anarchists. It's left-leaning, hippie liberals, hug it out, take a bunch of Molly, microdose on LSD before you go to work, just be in a happy zombie-like trance, watch a lot of YouTube, watch a lot of reality TV, but watch the shows that we permit you to watch, and don't watch anything subversive. If you do, we'll have to come and nudge your life with some form of honey trap or infiltration operation. So, you know, we're literally building the systems of our own demise, and, you know, the people that are building it are just happily going along with it. Burning Man's ultimate gift to humanity is Burning Man. Like, this is it. The destruction of humanity is, you know, Silicon Valley is going to build the tools to end the human species and deliver them quite happily, quite proud of themselves, because they're not even thinking about what they're doing. They're thinking about the art car they want to build for Burning Man so they can go there and, you know, take a bunch of Molly and get laid with some sparkle ponies. This is the sad reality of the degeneracy of our society. And, you know, Silicon Valley is not a place for innovation. It's a place where innovation comes from all over the world to be absorbed into the deep state. And the best innovation doesn't rise to the top. It doesn't get delivered out. The innovation that supports the narrative is what gets delivered to everybody, and Burning Man is a tool used to do that. So anyway, I hope I've cleared up a little bit what I think about Burning Man, acid tests, and the technocracy. If you want to know more about it, check out my series, Silicon Valley's Secret Weapon, The Shadow History of Burners, where I get into all of this in a lot of depth.